Hey, how's it going? In this video, we're going to build a simple Python app that goes to YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram to get the latest follower and subscriber counts, and then we're going to bring that back and store it in a SQLite database and then render it in a nice page. So we're going to use Python and Selenium to achieve this, so let's get into it. Alright, so the first thing we have to do is create a new folder for our project. So I'll use make_dir to make a directory, and let's call the folder follower counts. And now let's open this folder up in Visual Studio Code. I'll do that just by dragging the folder into the app. And now let's create a virtual environment to install all of our Python dependencies. So we'll type pip env shell to create a new virtual environment. And you can see this is the folder it created the new virtual environment in. And it also created a pip file for us, which will keep a log of all the packages that we've installed. So we'll be installing two Python packages for this project. One is Flask, which is a micro framework for Python, which will let us create a little web app with Python. And the second is Selenium, which is a tool that will let us automate a web browser to go to certain websites, pull data from those pages, and bring it back into our app. So let's install them now using pip env. We'll type pip env install Flask and pip env install Selenium. And you can see it added these two packages to our pip file. So let's close this. And now we can create a basic Flask app. So let's create a new file here called app.py and import Flask. We'll also import render template, which is a function in Flask that will let us render HTML templates. So we'll create a new app instance. And then we will create a route for the homepage. So we'll type app.route and create a function to go along with this route called home for the homepage. And let's render a template. So we'll type return render template. Let's call this stats.html. So when you're rendering templates in Flask, it knows to look for HTML files within a templates directory. So let's create that folder now. New folder, templates. And then we'll create an HTML file in here called stats. All right, I'll just put some HTML in here to start with. I'll give the page a title of follower counts. And let's just see if this works. I'll just put a heading in here with follower counts. And let's run the Flask app and see if this works. So open up your terminal again. And the first thing we have to do to run the Flask app is type export Flask app equals, and this is the name of our Python file that runs Flask, which is app.py. Once we've done that, we can just type Flask run, and it will run the app. So by default, Flask will run on port 5000. So let's open this up in the browser and check it out. So we'll type localhost 5000. And there you go, it is loading the HTML file. So we know Flask is running and it's able to render this template. So I'm going to minimize the terminal for now, and I'll just paste in some HTML for this little app, which I've already written, and I'll include a link to that in the description. So I'll paste that here. There's nothing fancy going on here. It's just static HTML. So we'll come back to this when it's time to actually make this dynamic when we're pulling data from the database. I'm also going to put in a Google font that I'm using and include a style sheet. So let's do that. So to link to the style sheet, we're going to use a Flask function called URL_for. And we pass it two things. One is a directory name, so static. We'll create this directory in a moment. And the second is a file name. So we're going to call it style.css. So let's create that static directory here. And let's create the CSS file in here. And once again, I've already written the CSS for this project because I want to focus more on the Python side of things here, not HTML and CSS, but I'll include a link to the style sheet in the description. So I'll paste that in and save, and let's go refresh the page. Sweet, so this is what our dashboard page will look like. We have the total YouTube subscriber count, the Twitter follower count, and Instagram follower count. And then every time we've used our little app to go and fetch this data from the web, we create a new record in the database, and so this will be a table with a list of records for every time we fetch this data. So again, this is all just static HTML right now. There's nothing fancy going on, but we're going to go ahead and make this dynamic as we build our script. All right, on to the fun part now. Let's build the Python script that will use Selenium to go to these websites and try to scrape data. So let's create a new file in the root of our project, and let's call it get_stats.py. And the first thing we need to do is import Selenium. So we'll type from Selenium, import WebDriver. WebDriver is what lets us open a new automated web browser window. So we just need one more thing from Selenium, which we'll use later on. So we'll type from Selenium .webdriver .firefox.options import options. This will let us pass custom options into the automated web browser, which we'll do a little later on. So I've decided to use Firefox as the automated browser with Selenium for this project, but you can also use Google Chrome. I just went with Firefox because Google Chrome was being blocked on one of the websites where I'm trying to scrape data from. So Firefox was the only option for my particular use case. So the first thing to do is set up the WebDriver instance. So we'll create a new variable called driver and make that be WebDriver.Firefox. And we need to pass in a special version of Firefox that is the automated web browser. And that's called Gecko Driver, which we have to download. So you can get that on GitHub. I'll include this link in the description. And if you go down to releases, you can download the version for your particular operating system. In my case, I downloaded this Mac OS one, but they have it for Windows and Linux as well. Once you download that, you will get a file called Gecko Driver, and just drag that into the project directory. So now we can link to this Gecko Driver file here in our Firefox WebDriver. So type executable path equals ./Gecko Driver. The / signifies the current directory that this file is in, and because get_stats.py and Gecko Driver are in the same directory, that's all we have to do to link to it. So we're going to configure one more option for the WebDriver, which is the amount of time to wait when Selenium is looking for an element on a web page. So web pages don't always load immediately, so we don't want to give up if the element we're looking for isn't immediately available. So we'll type driver.implicitly_wait, and we'll just say 10 seconds. So wait at least 10 seconds when we're looking for an element before giving up and failing the whole script. All right, now we can finally actually try to go to a website using Selenium. So let's do YouTube first. And we just have to type driver.get and then paste in a URL. So in this case, I'll paste in my YouTube profile page, my channel page, and let's just run this and see what happens. So open up the terminal, open a new terminal window, and we have to activate the virtual environment again. So let's just type pip env shell. Once again, this shows that our virtual environment is activated, and that means we'll actually have access to Selenium because we installed Selenium in our virtual environment. So now we can just type python get_stats.py to run this script. And you see it automatically opened up a new Firefox window and went to the URL we specified. So we can tell that this is an automated web browser because the URL bar has this orange stripe, and there's this little robot icon here, which says browser is under remote control. But we actually got to the page we wanted to, and you can see on this page, this is the number we're after. We're trying to get the current subscriber count, right? So this is the number that we want to get from the page and bring back into our app. So let's take a look at this HTML. Let's inspect the element. And we can see that it is a custom HTML tag, YT formatted string, but it has an ID of subscriber count. So we can find this element just by this ID using Selenium. So let's close this and let's try to find the element using Selenium. So we'll type YouTube count to create a new variable to hold this information. And we'll say driver.findElement by ID. So Selenium has many different methods for finding elements, and one of them is finding an element by its ID. So the ID is subscriber count. So let's find this and just print out what we get. So we'll type print YouTube count, and that will print to this console here. So let's run our script again and see what happens. All right, you see it did find something. So it found a web element. So now let's get the text from that element. So all we have to do for that is type .text, and we'll run it one more time. Awesome, look at that. We got the whole string here, 629 subscribers. So it's getting the whole element here because this is one element, so it's getting all of the text. So we want to just get the number, right? So because this is one string, and it's the two words in the string are separated by a space, we can just use a simple Python split function to split that string into two pieces, and then we'll just get the first one. So we'll just type .split by an empty space, and then that will create an array for us, and we just want the first item in the array, which will be the number. So we'll type 0 to get the first element in that array. We also want to convert this to an integer because it will be a string, so we'll just wrap this in int, so that when we're storing this count to the database, it's actually a number and not just a string. So let's run this one more time and see what happens. Awesome, there we go. We're just getting the number back and it is an integer. So we are done with the YouTube portion. That wasn't too bad. So let's do Twitter next. We'll type driver.get. So we can immediately go from this page, get the data we want, and then just tell the browser to go to a new URL now. And it's just as if a user was using the web browser. You might go to a particular website, you get the information you need, and then you type in the address bar a different website, and you just move on from there. The same exact thing, we're just automating it. So I'll paste in my Twitter profile URL here, and let's just run this to see what we get. All right, cool. So this is the number we want, the number of followers. So let's look at this to see what the HTML looks like. All right, so Twitter does this thing where it creates all of these randomized CSS class names. So we can't reliably use any of these because they probably will change every time the cache is cleared and the site regenerates. So we'll have to find a different way of getting the element we want. And as you can see, there's no ID on the element, right? There's just CSS classes. So we can't use an ID to get the specific piece we want either. But there is something unique here, which is this whole thing is a link. And this link's href attribute will never change for this user, right? It'll always be my username / followers. So we can find this link and then narrow down from there to get the particular text we want, which is this span. So we'll start with that. Let's go back to our code and we'll type Twitter count equals driver.find element by CSS selector. So we're not using ID this time because there is no ID. We're going to pass in a custom CSS selector. So we want to find an A tag, a link that has an href equal to this. And if we look at the site again, within this link, there's a span. And then within this very first span, there's a second span. And this is what contains the number that we're after. So we can use CSS here to narrow down to that. So if we use this character, we will get the next immediate span within this link. And then we know that we want to get one span deeper, so we can do it again, and we'll get the next immediate span within that span. And once again, we want to get the text from this element, so we'll type text. And again, let's wrap this in an int because I think it will work to turn this string into a number. And we'll print it out here. All right, let's run it. Awesome, there we go. We're getting 494 down here in our console. So we're done with the Twitter one as well. That was pretty easy. All right, so now on to the last one, which is Instagram. So Instagram's a bit tricky because they really don't like people programmatically scraping their website. They ended up blocking my script after I ran it a few times. So instead of going to Instagram directly, we're going to go to another website called PicYuki. So if we go to the browser and you go to picyuki.com/profile and then your username, you'll see that they've scraped Instagram and pulled in all this information. And we're just going to use this page instead of Instagram.com. So this is the number we want right here. So let's do this in Python. So we'll type driver.get, and we'll go to this URL, and let's run this first to make sure it gets there. So YouTube first, and then it goes on to Twitter, and then on to PicYuki. So let's inspect this element here. And we can see it's a span with a class of followed by. So we should be able to just get it by this class name. So let's try that out. So we'll type Instagram count to create a new variable, and then we'll type driver.find element by CSS selector. And then we'll type dot for class name, followed by, and I think this will work. So let's just get the text and let's wrap it in int to turn it into a number and print it out. Let's see if it works. YouTube, Twitter, and then PicYuki. Awesome, look at that. We got the number right here, which is 869, 869. So that worked. We got numbers from all three websites. So one more thing we should do here is we're manually closing that automated browser every time that we're done with it. So let's just programmatically close that at the end. So we'll type close WebDriver, and then we just have to type driver.close. And actually there's one more thing we should do. So right now we're running this script just on our computer, right? And it's opening this browser and it's doing everything we want it to do, and then it's closing the browser. But if we were to upload this script to a server and then use a cron job to run this script once a week or once a month or something like that, it wouldn't be able to open the browser because there's no display, there's no monitor connected to the server. So what we have to do is run this WebDriver in headless mode so that instead of opening a visual browser window, it just does all of it in the background. So let's go up to the top here, and we'll create a new variable called options. And this is where we're using this thing we imported earlier. And then we'll type options.add argument -- headless. And then all we have to do is pass these options into our Firefox WebDriver initiation. Options equal options. So let's run this again now and see what happens. And actually, before we do that, let's print out everything here. So we'll print the YouTube count, then we'll print the Twitter count, and then we'll print the Instagram count. And then it should automatically close the WebDriver afterwards, but it will all be happening in the background because it's headless now. So let's run it. And as you can see, nothing's popping up. It's just going and doing everything in the background. Awesome, there we go. We got the YouTube count, the Twitter follower count, and the Instagram follower count all coming back. It never had to open a visual browser window. It just did it all behind the scenes. So this is actually going to work when we upload it to a server. All right, so we're getting this data back now, which is awesome. Now let's save it to a SQLite database so we can use it in our app. So I'll clear out these prints, and let's create a new function up at the top here called save data. And we're going to pass three things into this function. One is the YouTube count, one is the Twitter count, and one is the Instagram count. So the first thing we'll do is create a new object for this information. So we'll have YouTube equals YouTube, which is the passed in variable here. And we'll do the same for these two. Let's also include a date. And we'll just need to import datetime for this. And then we can do datetime.now to get the current date and time. And we'll actually format this date into a string, just for simplicity. So I'm going to do the day, the short month, and the year. And one more thing we'll need to import is SQLite. SQLite comes with Python automatically, so we don't actually have to install that. We just have to import it. So let's connect to the SQLite database. So we'll type con, or any variable we want for the connection, SQLite, cursor.connect. And this is where we'll pass in the file where we want our data to be stored. So SQLite stores all data into a .db file. So let's create a name for our database file. I'll call it followers.db. And then we have to create a cursor to be able to manipulate the database. So we'll type cur equals connection.cursor. And with this cursor, we can actually execute database queries. So the first thing we'll do is create a table to store this information in. So we'll type cursor.execute, and we'll create a multi-line query string here. So then we'll type create table, and we just want to create a table if it doesn't already exist. Otherwise, we'll get an error. So we'll type create table if not exists. And then the name of the table we'll store this information in can be anything. We're going to call it monthly stats because I want to run this once a month. You can name this table anything you want. You could run it every single day, every single hour, whatever you want, but I'm going to do it once a month. So I'll name the table monthly stats. And this will also define what types of columns are in the database. So the first thing we want to store is the date. So we'll type date. And because we're storing the date as a formatted date, it'll just be text. We could store the date as a date object, but I'm just going to do it this way for simplicity. So the next thing we're going to store are the 3 counts: YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. And these will be integers. So we'll type YouTube, and it will be an integer. Twitter, integer. And then Instagram, integer. So now that we've created the table, if it doesn't already exist, let's do the insert into that table. So we'll create a variable to hold this insert statement. And then we'll type cursor.execute insert into the name of our table, which is monthly stats, values. So these are the values we want to pass in. And we're going to use placeholders to safely pass the data in so we're not vulnerable to SQL injection. So the first one is a string, right? The date is just a formatted date. So that's a string. So we'll put that in double quotes, and we'll use a string placeholder. And then we'll just create 3 more for the 3 integers. And these are not wrapped in double quotes because they will be numbers. And now we'll replace those 3 placeholders with the actual values, which are right here. So record date, record YouTube, record Twitter, and record Instagram. All right, so there's just 2 more things we have to do. Now that we've written this insert statement, we actually have to commit these changes to the database. So we'll type connection.commit. And then let's close the database since we're done with it. So we've created this new save data function. Now let's just use it at the end of our Selenium script. So if we go down to the bottom here, we'll just type save the data, and then we'll use the save data function. And we'll just pass in these 3 counts that we got. All right, let's test this out. All right, so it completed, and you can see it created a followers.db database file here. And we can't actually see this because this is all binary, but it did create it, so we know that that was successful. All right, so on to the last piece. Let's actually get this data from the database now that it's being stored and render it in our page. So let's go back to our app.py file. And again, we have to import SQLite here. And then in our home page, let's connect to the database. So we'll type connection equals SQLite.connect. And then again, the name of our database file, which is followers.db. And again, we'll create a cursor. And now we can actually write the database query. So we'll type a comment here, get all records. And then we'll create a variable to hold that data called records and run the query. So cursor.execute, select all from the name of our table, which is monthly stats. And then we just have to type fetch all to get all records. Now, instead of getting all of the columns from the database, we could just type the one we wanted here. but I want to get all 4 columns. I want the date, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. So I'll just use the asterisk to get all of them. So next we're going to pass this data that we fetched here onto the template. But if there weren't any records in the database, we want that template to know that and fail gracefully. So we're going to wrap this in a try catch statement. So it's going to try to get all the records. If for some reason it can't, if it can't connect to the database or no records come back, we will pass in an empty array. So records equal empty array. All right, so now that we fetched the data, we can close the connection by typing connection.close. And let's just pass this records array onto our HTML template. So we'll type records equal records. We can name this anything we want, of course. We could say data, and then in our template, we would use a data variable to loop through this, but I'll just leave it like this. All right, let's open this up in the browser and make sure we're not getting any errors. Let's refresh. Perfect, no errors. Again, this is just static HTML at the moment. This is fake content, but now we can make this dynamic. So let's go to stats.html. And here at the very top, we have the 3 large numbers. So I'm just going to make these 3 numbers represent the first record in the database. And if no records come back, I don't want this to fail, so I'm going to wrap this in an if statement. So I'm going to say if records length, meaning if there are any in the array. If there are 0 in the array, this length will be 0, so this whole block will be skipped. And if there are some records, then let's get the first one and get the first value. So records, the first record, and the first property is going to be the date. So for this first number, I want it to be YouTube subscribers. So we know we have date, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. So I want the second element in the data. So I'll do 1 because everything is 0 indexed. 0 is 1, 1 is 2, etc. And I'll repeat this for Twitter followers and Instagram followers. So this will be the third, and this will be the fourth. So second, third, fourth. We're not outputting the date up here. So let's save this and refresh. Awesome, there we go. We're getting these 3 numbers from the first record in the database. Now let's make this loop through all of the records that we have in the database. So down here, we have the table row with 1 entry. So we'll use this in our loop. So for entry in records and 4. And we'll just output each property. Entry 0, that will be the date. And I'll repeat this here. 1, 2, 3. Let's test this out. Perfect, there we go. We're getting the date and then each of the counts. And these are exactly the same as these numbers up here because this is the first record in the list and we only have 1 record in our list. But let's go ahead and run the Selenium script again to get another record here. So I'll do python getstats.py, and this will run in the background. And that's just completed, so let's go and refresh our page. And there you see we have 2 records in our database now. So if we were to use a cron job on the server to run this every day or every week or every month, we would slowly build up a bunch of records, but this up here will always be the latest record. I personally plan on running this once a month, so I would be able to look month by month down that table of data and see my growth over time. All right, that's all for this video. If you like this video, make sure to hit that thumbs up button. And if you want to see more videos on Python, Flask, SQLite, Postgres, React, and maybe some beginner HTML CSS videos, then make sure to subscribe and let me know down in the comments. All right, that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.